Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John McMahon, Director General of Vanier College, and also co-chair of the Consortium of English Language Colleges, Cégeps, and Universities. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that both Concordia University, the virtual site of this conference, and also Vanier College, where I work, are both located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk Nation, is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is the home of to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And of course, we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So I'd like to welcome all of you, all of the participants, to the Education and Vitality Forum, an event of the Interlevel Educational Table, or ILET, which is a committee of Concordia University's Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, otherwise known as QUESCREN. The forum is supported by the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglais, and we're very thankful for that. The title of this afternoon's session is Mapping the Demographics of English Language Education. So first, I'd like to introduce both of our speakers this afternoon. First, we have Darcy Springate-Floch, data analyst with Playfair Statistics. And the presentation of his title is Comparing the Presence of English Speakers and the English School System. Mr. Floch was born in the Eastern Townships and graduated from Bishop's University with a degree in International Political Economy. His work with Playfair Statistics focuses on the disparities and challenges faced by the English-speaking community of Quebec. Darcy also works part-time with the Parent Resource Center of Ottawa on municipal childcare access and early education metrics. So welcome to Darcy. Our second speaker will be Caroline Dufour, a data analyst and researcher with Playfair Statistics. And the presentation Caroline will be delivering is Education for Employability, Cross-Sectional Data Evidence. Caroline Dufour is a graduate of Bishop's University and is currently studying political science at the Université de Montréal at the graduate level. She also works as a researcher and data analyst for Playfair Statistics. Her interests include climate policy, social inequalities, political polarization, and quantitative analysis. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Darcy Springate-Floch, the first presenter.
Thanks very much. So this started out mostly as a mapping project, but actually, I guess I'll start with the limitations. So we took census data and compared it to point data of various English language schools of different levels, private and public. So there was some work assembling that database, and kind of with that, there are a couple limitations, like around the data involving private schools and the distinction between primary and secondary schools in the private system and in northern communities, and just generally. So that was one of the limitations. The other limitation we had was the 2016 census doesn't actually include anything about language rights holders. So we used mother tongue as a proxy. We used a amalgamated mother tongue. So anybody who included mother tongue as English as one of their mother tongues is lumped into this group. And then we also wanted to break down by the smallest geographies possible, dissemination areas, but that also means that you get limited like age and language kind of at that level. But interesting, yeah, the StatsCan is going to be including in, well, did include, I guess, in the 2021 census, questions related to language rights holders. And interestingly, I think their estimate is higher than ours. So I don't know if mother tongue is a bad proxy or what the ultimate result's going to be for the census, but I had looked at some of their 2019 test results, and it was actually interesting to see that we weren't overrepresenting potential English school attendees, I guess. So we started just looking at the change in the mother tongue, English mother tongue population between 2011, 2016. Obviously, 2021 will be great to see how that goes. And I think the biggest place we see growth is in Laval, both proportionately and in absolute terms. But there's also growth Montérégie, generally the South Shore, and Outaouais around the Ottawa region. And then we see shrinking populations in Estrie, Gaspésie, almost everywhere else. Lanaudière, another exception. And from there, we started looking at where the youth are, because it's not just enough to say that there's Anglophones somewhere. So we use the population 0 to 15 by administrative region. And again, there's this huge population in Laval. And that's going to keep coming up. Laval is sort of incidentally one of the focus points of this analysis. When we just sort of look at the elementary and mixed schools across the southern part of the province, again, the northern part is a kind of different story, I think. A different kind of analysis would be needed there. Generally, we see them clustered where the English population is. And obviously at this level, it's hard to see much at all. There's a giant blob of Montreal here, but when we start breaking down the number of children by the number of elementary schools in a region, we start seeing some big disparities from the provincial average. Some places like the Val that are remarkably higher, and then places where they're markedly lower. And again, yeah, this is just the mother tongue 0 to 6 population, so it's not a perfect representation of those who are eligible for English language education, but it's until 2021 the best that anybody has, I think. Although StatsCan had some proxies, but I don't know. And then, so if we look at the Lanaudière, Northern Laval area, these are dissemination areas shown, but actually census subdivisions are labeled. So the Terrebonne area has a large English-speaking population, no schools at all. Same with northern part of Laval. And if you look at Laval itself, again, yeah, it's there are areas where population has grown and schools haven't necessarily popped up to meet them. And in the Outaouais, yeah, it's much of the population is sort of focused around here in Gatineau and La Pêche, but and there is a school here serving this Western population, but I think, and when my work with Ottawa, we saw the Western population is generally growing there as well. So it's probably just a general trend. Secondary schools are a little bit more complex because of the mixed thing. So in this map, it's just representing the pure high schools, as it were. And again, you know, it sort of matches up with where you'd expect to see, although there's some gaps in places like when we break it down by region. Laval, again, is has a much higher population than the school ratio. And there's some places where it's pretty small population. And again, yeah, it would be great to have like school capacity and the degree to which these schools, like what grades they go up to and so on. But at my position, I don't really have access to any of that data. But then again, like this Laval area, Northern Laval, so Southern Lanaudière, it will keep coming up as a gap, I think. Here we see no high schools at all out in Lanaudière, and a handful in Laval, but all in the south. And then same with Montérégie is that the large English-speaking population near Estrie isn't really served by anything other than Massey Vanier. And there's a growing South Shore population that isn't served really by anything close. And then we just sort of did the same thing with colleges and vocational, let's say and vocational colleges. And I guess you're probably gonna see where I'm going with this, but Laval and Montérégie again show the big gaps there. And again, there's one small CDI college in Laval. Other than that, there is no presence at all of a cégep, and Moderator, again, there's a helicopter vocational college there and nothing else. So well, that's the end of it. You'd need some more granular data, I think, to come up with some real decision making, but I think this sort of gives an indication of where you could start with that. So if there's any sort of questions or anything, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, thank you very much, Darcy. I'm not seeing any hands up or anything in the chat right now, but as people formulate their questions, I have a couple. Were there any surprises in the data, in your findings, from when you started, what you expected to find and what you actually did find? And what were those?
Yeah, I think I kind of, in my head, I expected to find a bigger gap or like a very dwindling population in S3, but it almost didn't show up as remarkable in any sense. No, it's generally on the averages, because I'm from S3, and I guess my assumptions about that region really didn't pan out. But I guess I'm not surprised about the greater Montreal area growing. I suppose that's maybe a given. Although to the north, I was maybe surprised about that.
Okay, Cindy Finn has a question.
It's more of a comment, really. So thank you, Darcy, for putting that data together. It really reinforces some of the things we've observed. So I'm at the Lester B. Pearson School Board, and our territory is the western part of Montreal, but it extends into the Montérégie. And really the Montérégie is more like it's like a banana across the southern part, just across the river from Montreal. So we're in the Montérégie West. And so the data supports some of the moves we've made, and I believe our chair of our school board is on the call as well, which, you know, we've petitioned successfully now to the provincial government to get a new elementary school in the Montérégie West. So we had authorization last year, and we've just passed another resolution to go back to the government to say, we predict within the next few years, we actually have enough students to fill a second elementary school. So we're definitely seeing and living the effects of more families finding affordable housing with younger children out in that part of our territory. And so it's just a comment, not really a question. And the other thing I will say is I think also it will be very interesting to see what the most recent census data tell us, but it's also something we're observing. And there were recently reports in the French media this week about how even the French school boards in Montreal are starting to see a decrease. And in talking with my colleagues in the French service centers, the pandemic has just exacerbated this push out of urban centers, maybe partly because of housing costs for housing, but it's also just the pandemic in terms of wanting to be in a different space, maybe more teletravail, so people can work anywhere, and they're really, you know, we're seeing this exodus. So again, I'm not terribly surprised at what your data was indicating in the Laval area, because that's what we're hearing, that a lot of families are leaving and going points east, west, and north, south, and west. I don't know much about the east end of Montreal, but we're certainly hearing that families are moving and migrating. And of course, the difficulty when you look at schools, you know, we have some schools in our board that are quite undersubscribed, but you can't necessarily, the territories are so big, you can't pick up a school and move it to where the demographics would indicate. So right. We find ourselves, like currently we have students that are coming off island onto the island. And so it's a very complex thing for school boards to maneuver as the demographics shift in a particular school board's territory.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for that. It's cool to know it keys into reality a little bit.
Another question, Darcy. You had one of your last maps had shown in terms of cégeps, which obviously I'm quite familiar with. Now we have a lot of students who come from that area of Laval to Vanier. And also to the other Montreal area cégep. So obviously a cégep student has that ability to, you know, hop on the metro or drive to another location. Not the same for elementary students and high school students necessarily. So in terms of those areas where there's a discrepancy in the location of high schools and the English students who are there, what is actually happening on the ground then? Are those students who are English or indicating English mother tongue, and I'm assuming are right holders and eligible for English education, are they attending then French elementary and secondary schools? What's actually happening to close that gap that we're seeing on that you've illustrated very well?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to speak to that, but that would be interesting to sort of determine. And I could think of a few approaches you would take to look at that question. But yeah, I know sort of related where I'm from in Estrie, I think the Québec Elementary School used to be English, and all of their Anglophone students just got shipped off to Ayers Cliff Elementary, and that building was converted to a French school. So
Okay.
yeah, it's hardly an ideal solution either.
And did any of your data show in some of the smaller, in the regions, some of the smaller areas where they were actually sharing buildings, where, you know, half of the building was English, half French?
Yeah, I know that's definitely true in some of the schools in Montreal, like FACE and so on, but I think it's also true for some of the more remote communities as well.
Andrew Palucci has a question.
Hey, I'm not sure if Darcy will be able to answer this, but I see a lot of capable people online, so maybe someone else could help them out. What would it take? How much of a critical mass of English speakers in an area would it take to launch a new high school or elementary school?
Yeah, I guess that is a good question, and I don't really know what the average size of an elementary or high school is in Quebec, or what a functional size would be. Yeah, so if anybody else has thoughts.
Cindy.
Yeah, so this is a great question. Certainly there are ideal sizes when you're looking just from a pure efficiency administrative cost issue. You need a high school to be big enough to be able to offer viable course options at different levels. You need enough students per grade to form groups, since we tend to organize our high schools by subject and grade level. There are situations throughout the province. I know in the Eastern Shore School Board where they have a combined, elementary high school network, and so you can make it work. But again, you have to look at all the different variables. And I think it's worth pointing out that English rights holders have a lot of choices in front of them. Unlike the French speaking majority, or even the newly settled populations where in Quebec, Bill 101 dictates you go to French school. When you're an English rights holder, you can exercise your right to go to an English school. But that's always the dilemma for those of us trying to predict registration, because what happens is an English rights holder may choose to go private or public, English or French. So just having data about mother tongue doesn't always tell you where those families will enroll. We've seen some interesting trends in our own school board where parents might choose a French elementary school to get a basis in French, to be plurilingual and bicultural, but then make a shift to high school, come to an English high school for their secondary studies. So that's difficult to predict. So it's a tricky thing to just look at what language is declared in a census and know where English speakers will orient themselves for. And I'm sure at the CEGEP level, John faces the same issue, that you can have a sense of a community, but you don't know where they're going to choose to enroll or apply. And so it makes that kind of forecasting pretty tricky for those of us working in English educational institutions.
Yeah, very, very good point. As I mentioned before, in terms of CEGEPs, we know that students are mobile. So the discrepancy between geographical location and the location of the institution may not be as much of a factor, obviously. And, given the recent discussions and the current discussions in terms of Bill 96 and English CEGEPs and so on, it is extremely unlikely that there would be any support to construct other CEGEPs in other regions of Quebec. Okay, well, thank you very much, Darcy. And we will have perhaps time at the end. There might be other questions formulated in the meantime, but thank you very much for very interesting data. Our next presenter is Caroline Dufour, title Education for Employability, Cross-Sectional Data Evidence. Over to you, Caroline.
Hi everyone. So as you just heard, I'm Caroline. So I'm kind of taking this to the next step from what Darcy was just saying. He was talking about access to education, and I'm going to be talking more about employment opportunities that education offers. So more at the secondary education level and at post high school and things like that. So I'll be comparing the unemployment rates among Quebec English speakers and French speakers by their education level. So the first thing you need to know about the data that we're going to be looking at is that the language concept that I'm going to be using is first official language spoken. So this is a concept that's devised by Statistic Canada, and basically they look at different answers to the census, and they try to figure out which one of the 2 official languages of Canada are the most used by this person. So the first thing they look at is mother tongue, and then what languages you use at work and things like that to really put you in a category. Are you French or are you English? There are some people who don't fit in those categories because they speak English and French at similar levels, at similar quantities in their everyday lives. So what happens to those people is we lump them together, we divide that number by 2, and then we put them in French or English, so that everyone is either English or French in this, whether or not you have perfect use of English or French, if another language is the one you use the most. And then the second concept that we're going to be using is the unemployment rate. So it's basically the number of people in the labor force that are employed divided by the number of people in the labor force. So there's a couple limitations with the data that we have here, as always. So well, the first is the language concept. None of the language concepts are exactly perfect, but the first official language spoken is pretty good because it gives us a good understanding of like the realities that people live in the workplace. And it was the available data for this one. And then the second limitation with my presentation is that I'm not really going to go into a deep dive into employment rates and industries and education and things like that. It's really more of like an overview of what we can see, and the really overview of the comparison between the English and the French. So we're going to be looking at gender, breakdowns by gender, age groups, as well as visible minority status. And then if we have the time, we're going to be looking at regions as well. So I'm kind of afraid that you're going to end up with more questions and answers at the end of this presentation, but I'm hoping that will give us a good discussion point at the end. So the first thing that we can notice if we look at just unemployment rates in Quebec, comparing the English to the French, is that the unemployment rate for English speakers is higher than the unemployment rate for French speakers, whatever the level of education that they have reached. So we can see here in the different levels of education used by Statistics Canada. So there's people who haven't even had high school diploma, the people who do have their high school diploma, people who have an apprenticeship or trade certificate, there's college, CEGEP, university certificates, and then higher university certificates. These aren't quite like ranks because, for example, having an apprenticeship or having a CEGEP diploma, they're not like, they're just different, and one shouldn't be valued over the other. So these aren't to be understood as like a ranking of different diplomas. It's just different types of diplomas. So if we break it down by gender, well, the first thing we can notice is that unemployment among women is higher than unemployment among men, but it's similar in the sense that both English women and English men have higher unemployment levels than French women and French men in terms of the comparison there. So yeah, as you can see on the graphs, I think these are pretty explicit. So the other thing that we do notice is that the higher you do have, if you have university degrees, or you are more likely to be employed. So I guess one thing that we can notice here is, get degrees, and it might be easier to find a job. So if we break down by education level, what I found really interesting is that universally, whatever age group you're in, if you're English speaking, you are more likely to be unemployed, except if you are 65 or over. And you can see in these graphs here on the one on the right that the English speakers, the unemployment rate around 65 plus is actually lower than the French unemployment rate, which I found particularly interesting because I've heard comments about people who are saying, oh yeah, the unemployment rate among Anglophones is higher because Anglophones are older, so older people just tend to be less employed. Well, that's actually not true. What the data says is that Anglophones, when they are older, are more likely to be employed than to be than the French. And then, but on every other age group, then they are less likely to be employed than the French. So one last thing that I wanted to look at is the visible minority status. So the visible minority status is simply people who self-identified as being part of a visible minority. And so that's the way Statistics Canada presents the data. And so similarly, we can see that the higher the education level, the more likely you're to have a job, especially if you do not identify as a visible minority. Like if you look at the university certificate, diploma, or degree at bachelor level or above, for those who did not identify as a visible minority, for both French speakers and English speakers, it's much lower than if you have no certificate or degree, or even just simply a secondary or a high school degree. Yeah, what's interesting in here is if we look at those who identified as visible minority, the difference between Anglophones and Francophones is actually reversed. The minority Anglophones are doing relatively better than the Francophones. So it's also surprising to me because I've also heard comments saying that, oh yeah, well, the English community, they're immigrants, so obviously they have higher unemployment. But if you think about immigrants, those who are part of visible minorities, then it's still it's not the case. If they're Anglophone, they're actually doing slightly better than the Francophones. Except if we look at like higher education levels, then it's actually pretty close, which I found really interesting. If you look at apprenticeships, for example, or university certificates or degrees, so for for those who identified as a visible minority, the unemployment rates are pretty close, whether you are Anglophone, English speaking or French speaking. So there's one last thing that I thought would be interesting to, one last lens to look through the data is how does this translate according to regions? So to look at that, the different regions, I use the Réseau de Territoire des Services, so the health regions of Quebec, because I find that they're pretty representative of like how we understand Quebec regions as living here. And so what these maps show is actually the relative ratio of unemployment. So the way that's understood is you divide the unemployment among Anglophones by the unemployment among Francophones. So how this can be read is, for example, in La Côte Nord, you can say that the unemployment among Anglophones is more than 2 times higher than among Francophones. And similarly, you can say in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, it's actually, the unemployment among Anglophones is actually lower than the unemployment among Francophones. So anything that you see in green here is unemployment lower for Anglophones. Anything in red is unemployment higher among Anglophones. So this map here is just showing just general unemployment rates. But if we move on, this one is for low levels of educational attainment. So it's people who have a high school degree or not even a high school degree. So it's actually interesting to see that a lot of these are yellow. So they're 1 to 1.5 times the Francophone unemployment rates. So if you compare to apprenticeship or trade level of education, or even university BA or higher, you see that there's a lot less, like the ratio is a lot more similar across the regions. But yeah, if you compare the different maps depending on the different levels of education, I guess the answer to the question, is Anglophone unemployment rates higher than Francophone unemployment rates. Well, what these maps show is it depends where you live. So for this, I think it would be really interesting to go and look into like different industry types and break down to see, you know, where within tourism, maybe that could explain some of the different unemployment rates among Anglophones and Francophones. So I believe that would be something that would be really interesting to look into moving forwards. So just to wrap this up, to answer my question, which was really, are Anglophones more likely to be unemployed than Francophones, even when we look at things that affect employment chances, for example, education, gender, age, whether you're part of a visible minority and things like that? And the answer is yes, Anglophones are more likely to be unemployed than Francophones, even if at similar levels of education, even if you break down by gender and age except that they're 65 plus, if we remember the graph from earlier. And in the regions, it actually depends on which region they are living in. So I had a couple questions for you guys that I was hoping maybe you would have some insight on. So first I wanted to ask you if any of you were surprised by any of the results, depending on what knowledge you already had and maybe your experiences. And then I wanted to know if any of you had any insight on what we might be seeing when the 2021 census results come out. Do you think that we're going to see similar trends as in the Anglophones are have more unemployment than Francophones and along similar lines? And then my last question was, I didn't really go into any causal explanations as to why these results are what we see, and I was wondering if anyone had any insight on causal explanations as to, you know, why are 65 plus Anglophones more likely to be employed than Francophones, whereas in all other age groups it's the reverse. So well, thanks for listening, and I hope to get your insight on those questions.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Well, just on that last note, someone had a kind of a counter question that may be an explanation. Carol writes, could it be that French speakers are retiring over 65 than English speakers? Could it be that they're retiring when they're older than 65 more than English speakers do? Could it be that English speakers are staying in their jobs longer and not making room for younger people?
That's a pretty interesting point. So just to go back on the unemployment rate, that number that we're using, it is dividing the number of people who are employed by the number of people in the labor force. So the labor force doesn't take into account people who either have a job or would like a job. But it's interesting. Is it anyone else has experienced that? Maybe Anglophones do tend to retire later than Francophones.
I guess we just love working. John Davids has a question.
Hi, yes, thank you. And thank you, Caroline, for that presentation. I just had a comment and a follow-up question. My comment kind of pertains to the statistic about visible minority Francophones actually having a higher unemployment rate than visible minority Anglophones, if I read that correctly. And I just wanted to say that in my research, I look at visible minority linguistic communities, and specifically I've been studying the English-speaking Black community in Quebec. And when I compared the English-speaking Black community to the French-speaking Black community, the unemployment rate, and this is going off 2016 census data, was 13.5% for the English-speaking Black community and 7.9% for the French-speaking Black community. So what I think is that the term visible minority encapsulates many different groups within that, and perhaps if we were to break down that variable to look at those subgroupings, it could also be quite telling and a bit more informative as well. And my follow-up, my question I had for you is whether, when looking at unemployment rate by level of educational attainment, I know you didn't present it here, but by any chance you also happen to look at income, average or median, across educational attainment? between Francophones and Anglophones?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your comment. It is true that that visible minority group has all kinds of different people and different groups. So absolutely, like if you're interested in looking at that measure, my measure of it is obviously not enough. And so thanks for your insight on the Black Anglophones and Black Francophones in Quebec. And for your second question, I actually didn't look at income, but that would be very interesting. Across my research, I have been seeing that some people use income and education as like a proxy for each other, right? They're saying if you're more educated, then you have higher income. And especially I know in when people are asked to answer questions, if they're more likely to answer the question on their education level than on their income level. So that means that we usually have more respondents for education than income. And so that's why they're often used as a proxy for each other. But that's actually a really interesting question, because from what I've seen, they actually can't always be used as a proxy for each other. So it would be really interesting, I think, in some further research to look at income as a separate like measure. But I haven't done that yet, so I can't really answer to that question.
There was a quick question in the chat. How come Gaspé was not on the map? I'm not sure if it was an omission or.
I think that might be referring to some of the maps where Gaspé is in gray. So for some of the RTSs, the data, for example, I think for apprenticeship, we just didn't have enough people that we didn't feel comfortable showing that data. Usually if there's less than 15 or 10 respondents, we don't want to show that data because of Statistics Canada's roundings, where they always give us 10 or 15. So it's hard to say when you have a number of 10 people, you don't know whether that means it could be between 5 and 15 people, if I remember correctly. So our percentages become way off when we have very low population. So I don't feel comfortable showing that kind of data. So I believe that might be what was being referenced in that question.
Okay, and there are a couple of comments in the chat trying to perhaps address your causal questions. And Cindy Finn has a question.
It was more of a comment, really. Thank you for this data. Sometimes seeing data just raises more questions. And I don't think you have the answer to this question I have for you, Ms. Dufour, but I think sometimes when we look at Anglophones and employment rates, that's important, but it also raises the question about underemployment, because I don't think sometimes we're capturing, it may be that people have jobs, but they're maybe overqualified for the jobs that they're in. And I agree with your comment about it depends throughout the province where you find yourself. And the reason I bring up the issue about underemployment is I know QUESCREN had done a series of research briefs about a year ago. And when we looked at the data, one of the research studies they did was looking at the representation of English speakers in the Quebec civil service, and it's virtually nil. So when we look at, the government of Quebec is a significant employer, and I don't know the recent stat, but it's pretty significant that there are a number of people in Quebec employed by the provincial government. And when you see Anglophones are not represented there, it makes me wonder about some trends about where are people working, and are they perhaps working in jobs where they would maybe self-identify as underemployed. So I don't think census data tells us about underemployment, but I would just say it's probably an important consideration when we're thinking about the English-speaking community and the credentials they carry and where they end up in terms of employment.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting comment. And I agree. I would just add to that because I use the unemployment rate, so there's the labor participation notion in that. So this number doesn't take into account people who've fallen out of the labor force, either because they decided to become stay-at-home parents or because they couldn't find a job and decided to stop looking. So I just add on top of that these numbers don't take into account those people, and it would be interesting to see how those differentiate among the Anglophones and the Francophones across Quebec.
And just on that last note that you made, Cindy, as you may be aware, the prime purpose of the new consortium of CEGEP's colleges and universities was looking at issues like that. How can we retain our Anglophone graduates here in Quebec? And one of the major focus areas is the Quebec Civil Service, to increase the number of opportunities for graduates of English institutions to pursue careers in the Quebec Civil Service. So there's going to be significant work on that particular dossier in the coming months and years to increase the percentage that you so accurately describe as almost nil, very, very small. But we are addressing that as a consortium of CEGEP's colleges and universities. Any other questions for Caroline? I'm not seeing the hands or any other questions in the chat. As I did mention, Caroline, there are some comments in the chat. Could it be that leaving a community where they can't access higher education, students leave Quebec to obtain this education somewhere else in Canada and stay there? Another one, it would make sense to consider household income. It may be that lower income households have to remain active in the labor force as they age, even if they would prefer to retire. Another question I had for you was, do we know the French level, the second language level of the Anglophones at each of the university levels? For example, what is their proficiency in French? Is that known?
So not in the data I shown, right? That is really, we're trying to separate first official language. We're trying to separate, put you in a category basically. But I believe that would be really interesting to see also for allophones. So maybe for people who here have been put in the English, like have been qualified as English when actually their English isn't necessarily good enough to use in the workplace, but it's just better than their French. And same in the other way. So I believe that it would be really interesting to look at a bigger breakdown of languages, because from my experience looking at the data, bilinguals tend to be the better off. Whether you are a bilingual Anglophone or a bilingual Francophone, from what I've seen, and I haven't done a detailed analysis of it, but from what I've seen, you are better off in terms of income and employment opportunities if you are bilingual, and that is whatever your original community you're from is. And I don't know if Darcy wanted to add anything to that, according to what you've been looking at, Darcy, but I think there's another question.
Yeah, Brian Rock has a question.
Yeah, I'm here in Gatineau, and there is a brain drain, right? The provincial civil service is not hiring the graduates from the Quebec side who go to the University of Ottawa, to Carleton, to the Heritage CEGEP on our side, and the community colleges on the other. So that right now I'm like 20 minutes from Parliament Hill. So we basically are losing our young people to Ontario, and many of them are getting, because they are bilingual, they are getting jobs in Edmonton and Calgary and BC. So this is a difficult problem. And of course, the government's hiring policies have been this way for quite a while. So that is the emigration figures that are leaving Quebec, many young people, and that's really a shame.
From your experience, do you feel like people like these bilingual people, are they still living in Gatineau and just working in Ottawa? Because I know that's like something that does happen. Or do you feel like they're just leaving to Ontario generally, and so I guess that means that all of their income tax goes to Ontario instead of going to
No,
Quebec?
but not only that, if they find a job within driving distance, because housing on the Quebec side is much cheaper, right? We have a lot of MPs from across the country who live in Gatineau just because apartments and condos and houses are so much less expensive. Ottawa is one of these booming markets that most people can't afford a house anymore. right? So yes, the ones who can stay here, but obviously if you get a job in Toronto, you can't commute 5 hours each day there and back, right? So
Not with that
no,
traffic.
yeah.
So folks, we're almost at the end. We have to start wrapping up, but I see Patrick. Is that a question, Patrick? Or are you keeping me on time?
No, it's just a quick comment. I'd just like to validate what Caroline was saying, that we came out with a book on Bill 101 recently, QUESCREN. And there's a chapter in there by François Vaillancourt that demonstrates that indeed, but it looks at bilingualism, monolingualism among Anglophones and Francophones and employment, and it does validate that bilinguals are more likely to get or have lower unemployment rates, higher income.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, certainly, I'd like to, thank both Caroline and Darcy for sharing their data with us. Obviously, when you're presenting data, it generates a lot of questions and is really creates fertile ground for more study and more data. And the more data we have, particularly about the Anglophone community, we will be better able to address the questions surrounding vitality. Because if we're informed and we're able to make presentations based on accurate data, then it solidifies our case and gives us a rationale, to make various presentations, whether at the political level, the social, economic level. So I want to thank both Caroline and Darcy for their presentations, and thank all of you, the participants, for asking your questions and comments. Very interesting session. Have a great afternoon.